It wasn't pretty, and it was vigilante justice. The Western legacy was marred by their lynchings, lies, and lash. American legend has frequently glorified the Wild West, a time of anarchy, untamed frontier life, and tough individuality. However, there is a brutal reality hidden beneath its myths and exciting stories. From the middle of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, life on the American frontier was dangerous not only from rival Native American tribes and the wilderness, but also from other settlers, outlaws, and even the legal system. Because law enforcement was inconsistent and frequently ineffectual, both official authorities and vigilante groups applied harsh penalties. Many of these penalties frequently provided little opportunity for atonement and were intended to engender fear in addition to upholding law and order. The noose of justice, hanging. In the Wild West, hanging was arguably the most notorious and common kind of punishment. For major offenses like murder, horse theft, or cattle rustling, the image of a noose swinging from a tree or gallows became emblematic of frontier justice, and it was frequently the preferred method of punishment. This dude steals horses. Although legitimate authorities could execute hangings, vigilante organizations or lynch mobs were considerably more likely to organize necktie parties. Many towns and territories took issues into their own hands because there were no formal legal systems in place. Vigilantism emerged as a result in which armed settlers would apprehend criminals and administer their own brand of prompt justice. This type of punishment was frequently motivated by bigotry, mob mentality, or personal grievances, but it was occasionally founded on actual law enforcement shortcomings. Lynch mob hangings were frequently ruthless events devoid of the formality of a trial or a court execution. In the middle of the night, people who were sentenced to hang may be pulled from their houses or prison cells, strung up to the closest tree or post, and left to perish as a public spectacle. In certain cruel and slow hangings, the prisoners were left hanging until they suffocated. In some instances, the drop was sufficiently lengthy to cause an instantaneous neck snap, resulting in a faster death. Some legal authorities gained notoriety for their readiness to execute people by hanging. Judge Isaac Parker, the hanging judge of Fort Smith, Arkansas, was among the most notorious. Judge Parker condemned 160 persons to hang between 1875 and 1896, although only roughly 79 of these executions were really carried out. Although Parker was regarded as a fair judge, his court's reputation for imposing death sentences made it legendary. Parker's courtroom was recognized as a symbol of frontier justice, torture, humiliation in public, and tarring and feathering. Although it originated in medieval Europe, tarring and feathering is one of the most severe and degrading forms of punishment meted out to people in the Wild West. In order to make the victim a public spectacle of embarrassment and discomfort, hot tar was poured on their body and then covered with feathers. Tarring and feathering may not necessarily result in death, but it may cause serious burns, infections, and chronic agony. The oil would solidify and adhere to the flesh, tearing off layers as it was scraped away, making the removal procedure agonizing. People suspected of crimes including theft, fraud, or political opposition were frequently subjected to this type of punishment. As victims would be paraded through the town in their sticky, feathered state, the goal was more public humiliation than enforcing the law. During times of civil disturbance or when local communities wanted to punish anyone they perceived as traitors or spies, tarring and feathering was especially prevalent. Even while it wasn't as common in the Wild West as shootings or hangings, irate crowds nonetheless used it as a tactic, particularly when they wished to express their opinions in public. The whip of authority is flogging. Another cruel method of maintaining discipline and order in the Wild West was flogging or whipping. Flogging was especially common for less serious offenses, including theft, public intoxication, and disorderly conduct, and was frequently viewed as a compromise between death and incarceration. But even though it's seen as a less severe punishment, flogging may be incredibly cruel and leave its victims with long-lasting physical and mental damage. Flogging involves stripping the accused of their clothes, tying them to a post, tree, or whipping bench, and then lashing their bare skin with a whip, typically made of leather or horsehide. A person may suffer a few lashes, dozens, or even hundreds, depending on the seriousness of the offense. There were no uniform guidelines for how such penalties were carried out, and the judge or local sheriff frequently decided how many lashes a person should get. Flogging was viewed as a practical and successful method of deterring crime in the Wild West, when jails were sometimes overcrowded, badly maintained, or virtually non-existent. It gave authorities a quick and visible way to punish people without requiring them to spend a lot of time behind bars. Potential offenders were deterred by the threat of flogging and the public display that frequently accompanied it. The public aspect of flogging held equal significance in many frontier settlements as the physical punishment. Whippings were frequently performed in front of the municipal jail or in the square when sizable crowds would assemble to see the action. The theory was that when others saw someone writhing in agony from a lash, it would make them fearful and discourage them from committing the same crimes. In many instances, the punishment of flogging was coupled with extra humiliation, including making the person wear a placard that confessed their guilt or making them make an apology to the community. Flogging was a serious punishment, even though it was thought to be less terrible than hanging or shooting. Deep wounds and bleeding would frequently result from the lashes breaking the skin. A prolonged flogging session may cause the whip to rip into the victim's muscle tissue, leaving long-lasting scars and occasionally incapacitating them for weeks or even months. Particularly in the hot and unhygienic circumstances of the frontier, infections were a typical after effect, and many flogging victims experienced long-term health issues as a result. Flogging may be a death sentence in and of itself for some people. A person might die from the shock of a severe flogging if they were extremely frail, elderly, or unwell. Many flogging victims suffered from chronic pain or severe disfigurement as a result of the ordeal, and even those who managed to survive frequently suffered long-lasting bodily and psychological harm. Mob rule, lynching, and brutal executions. In the Wild West, hanging was not the only method of lynching. Any extrajudicial penalty or execution carried out by a crowd could be involved. The fact that lynchings were frequently highly ritualized, public rituals intended to terrify not only the victim but also anybody who might cross the crowd in the future, made them especially violent. Racial tensions were often the driving force behind lynching, with Black, Mexican, Native American, and Chinese people being the most common targets of mob violence. Much of the mob activity in frontier towns was motivated by racism as a result of the inflow of varied populations. These ethnic groups were frequently lynched instead of facing a trial after being falsely accused of crimes for which there was insufficient evidence. One glaring illustration of how bias could taint justice was the hanging of minorities in the Wild West. The local white people frequently supported these penalties, and law enforcement would either turn a blind eye or actively take part. The show itself acted as a message to other minority groups to stay put, in addition to the danger of violence. While hanging was a common method of lynching, other methods employed much more brutal techniques. Before killing their victims, mobs would occasionally subject them to torture. Tragically, tales of people being shot several times, burned alive, or beaten to death are frequently found in the chronicles of the Wild West. The lynchings of Joaquin Murrieta, a Mexican bandit, in 1851, serves as an example of how horrific these acts may be. Legend has it that Murrieta was pursued by the California Rangers, who killed him, severed his head, and preserved it in a jar to be displayed as a sign of justice throughout the state. Even though Murrieta's adventures have been exaggerated, his execution and the public display of his head that followed demonstrate the extremes that frontier justice may reach. Branding. Permanently marked. Branding was a form of punishment that permanently altered the physical and social identities of its victims. Cattle rustlers and horse thieves were usually the ones to brand in the Wild West, and the branding iron would frequently have the mark of the victim. A cattle thief could, for example, be marked with the rancher's initials whose livestock they stole. This kind of punishment was especially harsh since it left a noticeable and long-lasting scar, in addition to the agony that was experienced. By effectively labeling the offender for life, branding turned them into a social outcast. Those who were branded were frequently excluded from their communities or made to live alone. The frontier culture's ingrained sense of property and ownership was also represented in the branding practice. For many settlers, horses and cattle were their lifelines, so stealing them was considered one of the worst crimes. A thief could never escape punishment for their crimes by being branded, even if they attempted to relocate to a different town or region. Taking aim, the frontier's swift justice. In the Wild West, not all penalties were slow and agonizing. A few were swift, but just as vicious. Serious crimes were frequently punished with public executions by firing squad or single-shot pistol, especially in areas where official legal systems were still developing. The duel was one of the more idealized types of frontier justice, frequently depicted as a noble and respectable means of resolving conflicts. Although they weren't as frequent as popular culture makes them seem, duels did happen occasionally, especially between law enforcement officers and gunslingers. While dueling rules varied, most involved the combatants standing a predetermined distance apart and firing at each other, either simultaneously or sequentially. Some battles were fought as a means of settling scores between competing criminals, while others were fought over issues of honor or interpersonal conflicts. In a duel, the loser would typically pass away quickly, though not always without suffering, depending on how skilled the opponents were. In certain communities, especially those without formal courts or jails, offenders can receive a firing squad death sentence. During periods of civil crisis, or when a prisoner was deemed too dangerous to be kept alive, this method of execution was frequently employed. In other situations, police would shoot a suspect at first sight without waiting for a formal trial if they felt they posed an immediate threat. The possibility of getting shot by a bounty hunter or posse was a persistent danger for many criminals. In the Wild West, there was a strong gunfighting culture, and people who lived on the wrong side of the law frequently considered gunshot death to be a part of their job.